Iran begins naval exercises in the Straits of Hormuz. Plus, China responds to the United States' threat of additional tariffs. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Singapore. The two officials have much to talk about, including the escalating trade war between their two countries. We'll have more on that later in the program, but we begin with the latest on tensions between the United States and Iran. Let's get right to our panel. Joining us from Dallas is Merrill Matthews. He's a political commentator and a resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. Alexander Azadgan is a senior geopolitical analyst and a professor of international political economics. He's in Irvine, California. With us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution, a China-based public policy center. And joining us right here in the studio is my colleague, CGTN's White House correspondent, Nathan King. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Nathan, let's start in the studio. The latest news out of the Persian Gulf is that Iran is carrying out naval exercises near the Straits of Hormuz. That's, of course, a very strategic corridor for international oil traffic. Lots of oil tankers moving through there. What do we know about these exercises?
Well, the news flash is it's not really news. They do this every year. And so it's a bit like the US conducting naval exercises off the coast of San Diego or something. So you have to think of geography as their backyard. But it does, of course, come in a time of heightened rhetoric and also a massive change of policy with the US. So that's why they're under consideration. Also, Tehran has hinted that if the US goes through with its reimposition of sanctions, not just the financial ones that are due to come back in after they pull out from the Iran nuclear deal this coming week, but the oil sanctions, which have a deadline of November, that Tehran has hinted they could close the straits to oil traffic. So I think that's why you're seeing, especially in the American media, among the foreign policy establishment, a real focus on these exercises. But they are normal.
But normal, yes, but what about the timing? They've been pulled forward.
A few days, yes. Yeah. And the calendar can shift, but yes. And you, talking to American military analysts and those watching it, they seem larger than usual. And what worries the Americans too is the technology involved as well. It's not just about 100 ships and boats, but also drone technology. Iran has put a lot of money into tech, especially cyber too. So they're going to be the most closely watched military exercises, perhaps RIMPAC aside, which I just came back from, that we're going to see globally at the moment.
All right, let me go to Merrill Matthews. Merrill, let's talk about this relationship between the United States and Iran. The U.S., of course, unilaterally withdrew from that nuclear deal and has threatened the Iranians with sanctions again. But at a recent news conference, this is what President Trump had to say. Let's watch.
I would certainly meet with Iran if they wanted to meet. I don't know that they're ready yet. They're having a hard time right now. No preconditions. No, they want to meet, I'll meet. Anytime they want. Anytime they want. It's good for the country, good for them, good for us, and good for the world.
Now, Merrill, hours after President Trump said that, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said, well, it's actually not without preconditions. There are some conditions attached to this. When you look at this mixed message coming out of the White House, does the U.S. have an Iran policy?
Oh, I don't know that we have a very strong Iran policy, though we are trying to, we do have the State Department moving around with European countries and businesses trying to get them to go along with the sanctions. So there are efforts along that lines. I have a little bit of a different take with the president's response, though. You know, he is a big picture guy. He's not a detail guy. And so when you ask him the question, would you be willing to meet, I think he sort of just responds, yeah, I'd be willing to meet with anybody. When you get to the diplomats, they always put those caveats and details in there. So I don't know that it's that much of a mixed message other than just sort of the way that President Trump responds to things.
Alexander, what do you make of it? First, the president makes a threat. In fact, he said never, never threaten the United States. Then he does what amounts to an about-face, it looks like it, and offers unconditional talks. And the Iranians have responded. The head of the Iranian Council on Foreign Relations said the offer was, in his words, a humiliation. What do you make of that?
Thank you, Anand, for having me. It's always good to be with CCTV and your audience. I think the biggest mistakes the Iranians could make, or in my opinion, remake after the disastrous deal with P5+1 in July 14 of 2015 is to actually accept Trump's offer. Mr. Trump is fully aware that he and the United States are coming from a position of power, from strength, if there's going to be any negotiation, which I doubt the Iranians would ever agree to. So my concern is about the new liberals in Tehran who are in charge of the executive branch to think they can always be persuaded and that they should always be making compromises. The head of the IRGC made a very interesting statement, Brigadier General Jafari, a couple of days ago. He said Iran is not North Korea. This is his response to President Trump. Iran is not North Korea. Sit down in your Black House, obviously a reference to the White House, and be under no illusion that you would get to meet with Iranian diplomats, a reference to President Rouhani. Then the next statement is very telling. He said the Iranian people will never allow its government to negotiate with you. I think he was directly referring to themselves, the IRGC, as the Iranian people. You have to understand the IRGC is extremely upset at JCPOA to begin with,
right.
And they see the humiliation that they have been experiencing with the breaking of the Iranian economy. You have to understand the Iranian economy, the Iranian currency has lost 2/3 of its value in the past several months.
Yeah.
So they are extremely upset, and the only thing that they believe Washington wants is to renegotiate or negotiate over the missile advancement and the missile deterrence power of the Iranians. And that's an absolute no-no and a red line for the Iranians, especially at IRGC.
That's right, Alexander. You talk about the Iranian currency. I mean, the Iranian economy is struggling right now. In fact, President Rouhani has been given a month to come before lawmakers to explain the struggling Iranian economy. Does that give the Iranian leadership less room to maneuver in dealing with countries like the United States?
I don't think Iran has any leverage against the United States. Their expression of wanting to control the Strait of Hormuz, and if in fact Donald Trump would be erratic enough to not allow Iran to sell its oil, I don't believe that's the long-term solution. You have to understand that the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz back in the war between Iran and Iraq from 1980 to 1988, or the skirmishes that took place with each country bombing the other country's oil tankers or tankers that bought oil from Iran or Iraq, that was a two-country effort. Anything that would be destabilizing the world economy, especially the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the oil is brought onto the rest of the world, would only make Iranians look bad. So that's not a long-term solution. We have to understand this is eventually, or essentially, this is a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran is not suicidal to think they can get into war with the United States and not come out completely defeated. So we had not too long ago the sinking of two oil tankers in Bab al-Mandab Strait by Yemen, and that was sending a very, very strong signal to Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis the Houthis in Yemen.
Okay, let me bring in Qinduo Xu. He's in Beijing. Qinduo, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he recently had a meeting with the Foreign Minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Singapore. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Javad Zarif, his Iranian counterpart, that China will work hard to safeguard the nuclear deal. What do we know about that?
Well, I think what Foreign Minister Wang Yi means is like China will continue to purchase oil, will continue the current investment and trade with the Iranian side. So there are some reports that China has basically rejected the U.S. request not to discontinue to purchase oil from Iran, but promised not to increase the shipping of oil from Iran. For China, Iran, of course, peace and stability is important for this region, but also for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Iran is one of the important country in this region. So peace and stability will be critical for the implementation of Belt and Road Initiative in this whole region, through China to European countries there.
Nathan, an important point that Alexander raised then, that is this is a war against Saudi Arabia, a conflict we're seeing between Saudi Arabia and Iran right now. The US, in fact, is pushing ahead with a plan to create this new alliance involving 6 Gulf states, plus Egypt, plus Jordan. What is that about?
The Arab NATO, as it's been called, and given the state of current US-NATO relationships, maybe they don't want another one on their hands. But this kind of grew out of Trump's wanting to get out of Syria. And wanted for regional governments to basically deal with the counter-terrorism threat in Syria, but also bring more forces in. As you know, Trump has talked about pulling troops out of the Middle East and elsewhere. This would allow, he thinks, perhaps American strategic interests to be looked after by allies, including Saudi Arabia. It's not going anywhere fast. I mean, you have the key ally of the US, Saudi Arabia, essentially pinned down in Yemen, which it has overwhelming strategic forces and should be able to do that, but hasn't. And the real worry is that if you did have a united Arab NATO, then war perhaps with Iran would be inevitable. So I think there's some slow rolling of that, not just in terms of the region, but also in terms of the administration too here in the US that doesn't want to necessarily draw fault lines like that in the Middle East, especially as we know the continued isolation of Qatar, for example. This is a very, very difficult situation. And what's really interesting is, you know, this off-the-cuff seemingly offer to speak with President Hassan Rouhani, you know, it's been compared with the Pyongyang sort of rapprochement after the tough rhetoric. I can guarantee you that in Saudi Arabia and Israel, heads was spinning. And if that meeting ever happened, it would really sort of question the alliance structure that the Trump administration have really pushed since the outset. Friends with Israel, friends with Saudi Arabia, and trying to bring those two together as well.
Alexander, what do you make?
Let me weigh in on that.
Go ahead, Merrill.
Yeah, let me just weigh in on that. This attempt to bring some of the Arab nations together is actually, I think, a continuance. Barack Obama tried to get the Middle Eastern nations to begin developing their own resistance to this, so that they were carrying the battle, and the United States was not necessarily the primary player in there. And I see this as part of a continuation of that. I don't know how successful it will be, but President Trump would like to get the U.S. out of being the primary player and let regional countries be the real defenders of their area.
I agree with the last part, but actually what Barack Obama tried to do, along with the countries that signed the Iran nuclear deal, was actually make Iran a stakeholder in the region as well, and actually try and lead to some sort of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so they would become much more, less tension and more regional players, not just relying on the Gulf Cooperation Council. So that dynamic is not apparent in the Trump administration.
Alexander, what do you make of an alliance that the United States is planning, that is talking about an anti-Iranian alliance, effectively?
Absolutely.
With that,
actually, I believe that it's very transparent. President Trump's first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia, and during which he sold $110 billion worth of weapons, and in 10 years, that's going to be $350 billion, making Saudi Arabia the third largest spender when it comes to defense after United States and China. I believe in what your other guest was asserting, that to some extent the Iranophobia that's taking place across the region, implemented obviously vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, is Trump's effort, his sort of subcontracting this animosity to the Saudi Arabians, and this is a feud that really goes back to thousands of years ago, even before, hundreds of years ago, forgive me, even before there was a nation of Saudi Arabia in 1932. There are people, the neoliberals in Iran from behind the scene are sending some signals to President Trump, and the responses we've had from President Trump is sort of a pickup from where they followed up. The daughter of a very powerful Iranian politician, Faiz Hashemi, has openly called for negotiation with Washington at any cost, and this, of course, is very, very insulting to the Iranian people, and especially the IRGC, which is conservative, which is the elite military body, which, by the way, is orchestrating a lot of these military exercises with their speedboats at the Strait of Hormuz. So I believe a lot of this is for the purpose for the satisfaction of Trump's goal towards the internal politics in the United States, you have to keep in mind in about 3 months we have our midterm elections in November of 2018. Many of us are forecasting that President Trump and the Republican Party are going to lose big time, that at least one of the houses in Congress, either the Senate or the House of Representatives, is going to be given back to the Democrats. So all these rapprochement and all these extending of so-called the olive branch to the Iranians is to satisfy and to recreate the image of President Trump here in the United States. As your other guest said, we had these very undiplomatic talks of fire and brimstone exactly about a year ago at the UNGA by President Trump. So and we saw how he sat down with the North Korean leader. He thinks he can replicate this with the Iranians, and basically nothing could be further from reality.
Qinduo, as you pointed out, the United States has not been able to persuade China to cut back on oil imports from Iran. But here's something else that was reported. It was reported by Bloomberg. Bloomberg says that China has said it will not increase the current level of imports. Now, according to Bloomberg, the fact that China will not increase Iranian imports would ease concerns that China is working to undermine U.S. efforts to isolate Iran. So is China having it both ways here?
Well, for China, of course, China has this tradition for honoring the international commitment or, UN resolutions. This is, the Iranian deal is an international commitment by the, basically the 6 powers, most powerful country, as commitment to protect provide the security for the Iranians in exchange for their peaceful nuclear development, reducing this military purpose over there. So this is actually serve the interests of everybody, the regional countries, of course, the security of the European powers. That's why European powers, they are working hard to preserve the deal, although they know it's very difficult given how powerful the U.S. is in terms of its economy, in terms of its financial system over there. So China is basically doing, okay, this is my commitment to this deal. I will continue, but at the same time, China doesn't have any intention to, to basically to create more, let's say, more divisions with the United States in terms of the Iranian issues here.
Merrill, so here we have other. Sorry, you want to say something?
Yeah, we have to also understand that after 42 years, if I'm correct, United States is going to sell oil to China. United States, unfortunately, or Mr. Trump, unfortunately sees everybody who would be in the way of U.S. selling oil to China as an adversary, whether it's Russia or Iran. So this is happening at the same time that we're going to have trade wars. So this thing is very convoluted, very complex, and we have to see what happens with that. Nobody's really talking about the oil competition element into these things.
Right, Merrill, one quick point on this issue before we move on to the trade dispute, and that is the Iranian leader Hassan Rouhani says the U.S. pullout from the nuclear deal is illegal, but Rouhani also said the ball is now in Europe's court. Really, can this deal survive without Europe? Can the other signatories keep it together?
I think it'd be very hard. And it's not illegal in the U.S. Barack Obama did not go through the normal process of getting Senate confirmation for this. So it was just his word, so the next president can leave the deal. So I think it does depend upon Europe trying to make sure this thing stays, if it's going to. And I think the U.S. is putting an awful lot of pressure on Europe to try to pull back on that because, as pointed out, the financial system here that the U.S. has so much leverage in is just going to, other companies do not want to be involved if the U.S. is going to be fighting them for it or penalizing them for it.
The Europeans are so angry about this because, there was the JCPOA essentially working. And the fact that the US pulled out unilaterally is fine, but the fact that they are now putting pressure on the Europeans to pull out as well is really, really creating bad feeling on top of everything else.
All right, we need to take a quick break right now. When we come back, China responds to the threat of new US tariffs with a plan of its own. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.